A dovolte mi pozvat účastníky či řečníky z druhého panelu, konkrétně Mr. SCHÜTTE, OECD, Mr. Vansata, Austrian Development Bank, Mr. Akindende, consultant, a Mr. Valeš, který nám tu chybí. Ne, je tady, akorát jsem ho neviděl. Pánové, prosím, přijměte místo. Please, gentlemen, join me here. Děkuji, tak to bylo nejrychleji, jak jsem to zvládnul. Jako prvního bych poprosil Mr. SCHÜTTE, I'll ask you to join me here, or actually it's your turn. Mr. SCHÜTTE is from OECD. In particular, he's head of Development Finance Division at OECD Development. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I would have referred to the distinguished deputy ministers, ladies and gentlemen, many thanks. It's a great pleasure, it's an honor for me to talk here about the financing of development of the 2030 agenda and the role of the private sector. I would like to thank the Czech Business Platform for Development Cooperation to giving my organization here the floor to talk about this topic. What I'm going to do is share a few words with you about the transformative agenda that last year the international community agreed upon and the role of the private sector that's playing into it, the opportunities for the private sector that comes out of this agenda. I would like to share a few words and ideas and thoughts about the work of the OECD, the Development Assistance Committee in particular, in this regard, and then I would like to finally share a few words in regard to some takeaways from the peer review that we just had as the OECD DAC of the Czech Development Cooperation System in regard once again to its work to the private sector. Now, as my previous speaker already referred to, I mean, we are all aware that 2015, well, we would refer to as a historic year. We had 4 international conferences which define basically an international vision for a better future, if you like. At the core of it is the adaptation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which describe a universal agenda that applies for both developing countries and developed countries, North and South. Some people say we are all developing now, given the fact that all of our countries have certain areas where we can kind of live up to these SDGs. Prior to that, we had in Addis Ababa the meeting that was dealing, well, how do you finance actually these kind of massive investments that are needed for that? We had the World Humanitarian Summit, which was an agreement of how to tackle the challenges of fragile states, of massive displacement of people, of migration, and out of which a New Deal came. And then obviously finally we had the agreement in Paris about the new climate regime. Now, all this together is what we all know is being referred to as the 2030 agenda, because that's the time frame by which many of these problems are to be tackled, and we hopefully see then also a change in the trends and the threatening trends. Now, what is common to this? All 4 conferences and the agenda is really the private sector. That the private sector is at the center of this 2030 agenda. For those from the private sector, this will be probably astonishing, but basically prior to that, development cooperation, international cooperation was being seen primarily as something that was driven by the public sector. and the private sector would only be called in once basically the public sector had agreed upon a program or anything like that. The idea now really is that the private sector, the promotion of the private sector, the inclusion of private sector actors is really at the center of development. Without that, development will not be sustainable and will not take the scale that we need really to drive this agenda. Now, two areas I think, what at least we perceive as really crucial, and the deputy ministers have already referred to them, is one, the mobilization of private capital, if you like, and we'll say a few words about that. And then secondly, also the new forms of public and private partnerships that are necessary and that are mutually beneficial. Now, mobilization, the guesstimates that are being done by the UN in regard to what kind of finance do we require in order to fund the SDGs are mind-boggling. They are very, very high. They go into trillions. Whereas currently the total amount of concessional finance that the North is providing to the South is in a magnitude of about 135 billion US dollars. A lot of money, we all know this, being provided by our taxpayers. But nevertheless, the gap is massive. And the general idea is about that is to look at probably, if one looks at the total capital that is floating around in the world, these massive investments are still rather small. So we do have private capital looking for funding for good opportunities. And quite often the developing countries provide these investment opportunities. Colleagues of mine are talking about a wall of money, if you like, that is separating the North from the South. For some reasons, and we are looking into this, the money is not flowing. So the mobilization dimension of it is rather finding new partnerships, probably new regulatory form, innovations of financial instruments, new financial institutions, as the deputy ministers have referred to, in order to unlock basically these opportunities. The other area is rather the new kind of new partnerships. And as I have been referring to, given the fact that previously we had rather the public and the private and, if you like, separated camps, what we are currently seeing is really a very, very lively discussion from public and private, and I think today's event is part of that discussion, of how can the public and the private communicate, work together better. One area that is really required is basically developing a common language, because words that the public sector means and the kind of language the public sector representative talks are not necessarily those that the private sector understands. The private sector, once again, thinks in different dimensions quite often when it comes to business opportunity. The time horizon of making decisions is a different one. Whereas the private sector obviously is looking for opportunities for rapid decision-making, for taking opportunities in a strive, if you like. The public sector, especially when it comes to complex issues, is rather developing a program. It's rather a longer process that only once a decision is being taken, then action is being implemented. We also require institutional capacities that are changing, both on the public side, that basically allows for this better cooperation with the private side, but also on the private side to better understand the public sector. Now, I had the pleasure about a year ago to think about this with a couple of colleagues at the World Economic Forum at a meeting in Dubai. And at that time, we not really seriously referred to these new public-private cooperation forms as 4PC. So it's profitable, it has to in order to attract the private sector, but painful public-private cooperation. Why painful? Because what we're talking about probably requires both the public and the private sector to step out of the comfort zone you know, to really ask fundamental question, what is business all about? Where's our comparative advantage? What are opportunities? How can we be more sustainable in what we do? Obviously, the public sector is being challenged of coming up with better answers to the needs of the private sector, better tools, better processes when it comes to decision making, probably more appropriate governance. We talk about transparency, and I just had the pleasure to talk with my colleague from Michael van Carter from the Austrian Development Bank about that. So there are a lot of changes happening, and I think what I would like to convey to you is, looking at the international debate, this is very much work in progress. There are no easy answers to that. And I think people that are very much at the top of discussion know that this is something that will take years, maybe a decade basically, to develop further. And looking at the agenda, I think my co-speakers will certainly give some highlights to this kind of work in progress that I'm referring to. So that's the transformative agenda that we are looking at, which we believe, and that's my second point, certainly provides a lot of opportunities for the private sector. We don't know exactly which kind of private sector, which kind of opportunities, but we believe with the private sector being center stage and the overall, if you like, pie, the volume of funds that go into the private sector, a lot of opportunities will arise for the private sector to be used. And it's basically, we're talking about obviously substantially increased amounts of funding. We believe it will be a much broader also public network of instruments, of support, of knowledge that will be provided. We think there will be also alternative funding opportunities, not only from the private sector, but also from other actors. And we also believe that we look into basically venture into untapped markets. Many of you probably have heard already about the bottom of the pyramid idea. The fact that we have about maybe a billion of people worldwide, which are, you know, more and more having the financial means, and the moderator referred to this, to the growing middle class, that are basically demanding products, demanding services. Quite often this requires that we innovate the kind of products and services that we provide. But there are huge amounts of opportunities out there. One example that comes to mind comes from Kenya, where I spent a couple of years, M-Kopa, and it's a combination of smartphone, cashless payment system, and solar energy. And just to explain this, because I always find this really impressive, Kenya, only 40% of people are linked to the grid. So we have massive rural population which are unlocked to the grid. Kids cannot learn very late into the evening because they have no lights. People cannot continue to work. People cannot listen to news. So a company that has been growing very rapidly is providing solar panels. Okay, you think this is not unusual, but basically the solar panels are being provided on a lease basis, and the payment of these solar panels is being done by very, very small daily amounts by smartphones, because we have, you may have heard in Kenya, M-Pesa, which is a cashless payment system. And now the trick comes, if you don't pay, automatically your solar panel will be basically shut down. So it's a big opportunity, and it's a use of innovative new technology which allows really to untap new markets. Let me come to my third point. What is the ongoing work of the OECD DAC? And maybe one or two words of the OECD DAC. I mean, you probably know here at the OECD there's the so-called Development Assistance Committee, so the DAC, which for decades is the fora where basically the governments, the provider of concessional funding, are meeting. And we have Peter here, who is the Czech representative at the DAC. And what the DAC basically strives for is to help its members to develop more effective, more efficient forms of cooperating, of providing its development cooperation. And it does so by doing a lot of analytics around data. And for example, myself, I'm also very much dealing with data issues. Then secondly, we bring people together, not only from the public side, but also from the private side, from the CSO communities, in order to learn from each other. And on that basis, basically come up with best practice, as well as policy recommendations. And then also the OECD and the DAC has the power, if you like, to set certain standards, to set certain directives, which then basically define to a certain extent the rules of the game, if you like, and are being observed by other DAC and OECD member countries. So that's the DAC, that's the OECD. What we have been doing is we have been focusing the last 2-3 years very massively of better understanding this emerging agenda of the private sector being center stage through a number of flagship publications. One I would like to mention, that's the so-called Development Cooperation Report of this year, which kind of outlines how the private sector can help to fund the 2030 agenda. And one takeaway that I would also like with you, coming mostly from the private sector, is that also the report shows that if you are investing in sustainable development, you also are, from a profit perspective, a more sustainable private enterprise. So the research shows, these kind of things very much go hand in hand, and it's not only that you can do good in supporting sustainable development here in the Czech Republic and worldwide, but you also are a much more healthy company. And that's basic research spearheaded also by among others, by McKinsey. Now this flagship project report has a couple of pillars, and I would like to refer to some of them. One is ongoing work as what we refer to as blended finance. So the big amounts of funding that we need, a key approach to that is basically that the public sector tries with its own means to basically help private capital to be mobilized. So it's a blending of public and private capital. For example, through guarantees, through various forms of taking over risks, of providing for some grant capital to at times maybe subsidize public funding to set up institutions. That is something that is really becoming more and more center stage of development cooperation, I think, going forward. An area that is, I think, fascinating is a social impact investment. So that goes into this area of the bottom of the pyramid idea that we have untapped markets, and this social impact investments aims at providing companies with the opportunities, not only with the objective to basically make a profit, get an adequate return for the risks that they're taking, but by doing this also to basically make a contribution to sustainable development. And what is important there, and that's the reason why we have the word impact there, is that you kind of predefine what kind of objective would you like to reach. So what kind of impact would you like to have in very concrete terms, and you basically come up with a contract with the public sector saying, I can step in and deliver potentially also a public service, and you pay me adequately if I reach this kind of impact. And it shows that these kind of new forms then of public-private cooperation is providing quite often, if you like, a public service by the private sector to a much reduced cost and to a higher impact. Now, dealing with data, you will not be surprised that we do a lot of work on tracking these private flows. We have done a couple of surveys, have asked all our members and the multilateral development banks basically, if we talk about, you know, the public-private cooperation, what are you actually doing? Because it's something that is rapidly growing, and the deputy ministers have referred to that. And basically, obviously, studying what is happening allows us then also to better understand what is working, what may not be working as positively as it is. The DAC is also the guardian, if you like, of official development aid, ODA. Work that we're doing currently is to see that, for example, the contributions by the bank, the Austrian Development Bank, or the German DEG, or the Dutch FMO, or the Danish IFU, is being better captured in ODA. So that's something we refer to as private sector instruments. And the idea is not only to track it, to know better, but once you track something, you also incentivize a certain behavior. And if you can account that as part of official development aid, you provide an incentive for basically doing more private sector work. You know that most countries in the north are adhering to a 0.7% of GDP to provide it as ODA. Many countries, also my own, I'm German, is obviously not reaching that objective at all. So kind of counting a little bit of the excellent work that development finance institutions do, counting that as part of ODA is also a way to make a contribution to reaching this 0.7 objective. But I think more importantly, it is incentivizing private sector instruments. We have also something that is a bit more abstract, if you like. We're also putting into place a measurement framework for this 2030 agenda, together with other colleagues from the UN system and the World Bank, that goes far beyond the ODA and is trying to capture these various financial flows from the north to the south. Once again, in order to better allow also recipient countries to distinguish between the various financial flows that are coming towards them, but also for us, if you like, on the provider side, to make smarter choices as to where scarce public resources should be invested in order to mobilize private finance and give the private sector opportunities. Let me conclude with a few words in regard to, if you like, to the Czech private sector, and I will not pretend to be knowledgeable about this, but I will share a few words that are the conclusions of a so-called peer review. So all DAC members every 5 years basically expose themselves, if you like, to be reviewed by other DAC members. And this review is then being written up into a report with recommendation. And the Czech Development Corporation was for the first time reviewed this year, started of last year. And my, if you like, political boss, Charlotte Petri-Gornicka, was just here yesterday, and you may have participated at her presentation of this peer review. I understand it has been an extremely positive review with a lot of recommendations going forward. And the peer review says that the Czech private sector has certainly the potential to support this big agenda that I'm referring to. That the fact that this platform provides an excellent platform and a fora basically to discuss about the way the private sector can contribute, but also how the public sector can better support the private sector. I understand that your government, the Czech government, and the ministers referred to that, are working also on the strategy in regard to how this private sector potential can be lifted. But the report makes also the point that it is rather basically the private sector as a provider of additional investment and as a partner in development that should be further stressed, and somewhat a little less so as a recipient also of funding coming from the Czech Development Assistance Fund. You're all aware that there is an international agreement of so-called untying development assistance. There are good reasons for that. It's more cost effective. It allows everybody to compete for a bigger pie, if you like. And also it is something that has been agreed formally, if you like, internationally a couple of years ago, and DAC members are supposed to see that their aid is increasingly being untied. And you know, I believe the pressure to untie aid will continue to be coming both from companies, but also from the civil society and others. And obviously the figures that we provide and produce certainly show also that this is something that should be preferred. But the potential for all of you to then also tap into a bigger pie is certainly there. Let me just summarize what I hope I have shared with you is that the private sector is center stage for the 2030 agenda, that there are more opportunities for the private sector going forward, that the private sector is really a partner in development, that however the forms of this partnership is very much a work in progress, and I think it's excellent that we have also this group here to help to them to learning and testing and prototyping process. Yeah, and I think that overall this is an exciting journey that I think we're all very glad to be part of. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schütte. Very interesting presentation indeed. I very much appreciate especially the words about common language. I think that's a crucial issue right now in this chaotic world, if you will.